Hello and welcome to Chapter 8 devoted to planning for procurements. This is part 2 of the planning procurements topic. In this chapter we will talk about soliciting and evaluating proposals from vendors. So this part of planning is much closer to the implementation side of procurement management. Chapter 8 video presentation, just like all video presentations in this part of the course, are based on a book by Quentin Fleming titled Project Procurement Management, Contracting, Subcontracting, Teaming. Let's start with the learning objectives or learning outcomes. After completing this chapter, you should be able to discuss some of the main issues in selecting prospective suppliers. You should be able to list some of the common names for documents used to obtain information about simple commercial off-the-shelf items. You should also be able to explain what model contracts are and what they are used for. You should be able to list and briefly discuss the most common sections of a model contract and how those sections can influence subsequent requests for proposal documents. You should be able to explain what statement of work is and why statement of work is central to model contracts and requests for proposals. You should also be able to explain why it may be a good idea to introduce competition into procurements. Also, you should be able to list and briefly discuss the 3 main ways of introducing and managing competition in procurements, list and briefly discuss the main sections of an RFP document, and also explain how responses to an RFP document can be evaluated. So those are the learning objectives for Chapter 8. Now, let's start with some preliminary thoughts. Soliciting information from sellers begins the implementation of the procurement management plan. Now, as the saying goes, you need to be careful what you ask for because you may actually get it. So this is the dilemma present at this phase of procurement. You may think that you are doing yourself a favor by spending a lot of time and devoting a lot of resources to clearly specifying both at the technical and business level what you're looking for from other vendors. But sometimes this diligence, this extra time spent at the planning phase may actually backfire because as the project progresses, you may change your requirements or you may realize that you need something different or you may gain an additional understanding of what needs to be delivered for your project. And because of that, all this work not only will be wasted, it may also backfire on you because sellers or vendors may actually deliver what you ask for and not what you're asking for now. So this is the dilemma, the challenge that go into this phase of procurement planning. But in general, what you ask from potential sellers must be consistent with project requirements and project schedule. Solicitation of proposals from vendors can take different forms depending on the category of procurement. And that's why early classification of procurements is essential because different procurements may have different approaches towards soliciting information from prospective vendors and also different names for the forms or documents used to solicit this information from vendors. Some issues or preliminary thought that go into planning for soliciting information from prospective suppliers are listed here. So number 1, do we have past experiences dealing with similar purchases? If so, what were the past mistakes, best practices, and overall lessons learned? Of course, answering this question or questions is possible only if an organization maintains a formal project archive or lessons learned reports archive, because this is the repository that can give you answers about questions in relation to past projects that you carried out. Also, have we had experiences with sellers we are soliciting information from? Some companies have complex ranking systems for potential suppliers, and this ranking system is a collection of files for each of the suppliers that they're working with. And if you have this kind of collection of files on potential suppliers, this is where you can get information about past transactions and also quality evaluations of past product or service deliveries. If you don't have this formal ranking system, then it may be difficult to get information on past experiences with suppliers from which you are soliciting information from. Another question or issue, do we want to pre-qualify suppliers? It may be a good idea if you're trying to produce or procure something new or something that is complex at the technical level. So if that's the case, then you want to make sure that vendors you solicit information from can do the job both on paper and in real life. You see, it may be a waste of time on both sides and also somewhat unfair to solicit information from vendors who cannot possibly deliver what you're looking for. Not only you'll be wasting time on your side, you will be also wasting time on the side of the vendor, and you will make the entire bidding process or solicitation process unfair to them, because you know that they're not going to be selected for this project because they simply lack the capabilities needed to deliver a product or service that is required for your overall project. Is project funding stable? Private funding, meaning project funding in private corporations, private organizations, seems to be more predictable. At least it's analyzable in a sense that it's driven by profit and loss considerations, while government funding is often driven by considerations other than profit and loss. They're driven by high-level political agendas. And that's why, and overall government projects, they seem to be plagued by bureaucracy and delays more, especially when it comes to funding. So if your funding comes from one of the public or government sources, then you may want to exclude potential vendors, because not all vendors will be tolerant to those kind of delays in funding, and most importantly, towards delays in you paying them for their products or services. So this is something to think about. Also, will there be any potential pressures in awarding major procurement contracts? Some political considerations, they're not bad, they're not shameful, they're quite valid and important. But of course, some political considerations that impact procurements, they border corruption, where certain vendors, certain sellers are favored without any rational objective reasons. But anyways, this is something to think about, since political forces often mysteriously impact outcomes of projects without people even realizing what happened. Also, are there special considerations incorporated in the prime contractor agreement or prime contractor contract, which must be addressed in selected procurements, and how those special requirements or special considerations will impact solicitation planning? So this is what it means. Sometimes the prime contractor, meaning the primary vendor, the primary seller that you're dealing with, may have provisions for making certain procurements. They will say, okay, if you're working with us, then you will give us the right to buy certain items or services from our pre-selected list of vendors. They may use a number of reasons to justify that. They may say that they have a good working relationship with those vendors, or they meet their quality standards. But this will constrain your procurements, because you will not be able to make any decisions in relation to those procurements that will be actually managed or carried out by the prime contractor. Another consideration: does the government-funded project require procurement from special categories of vendors? So those special categories may include women-owned businesses, Native American businesses, disadvantaged businesses, and stuff like that. So this requires typically special handling and special attention if your project funding comes from a source that requires that, and most likely that will be some sort of a government source. Now, the general buying approach consists of the following steps, although not all the time: advertise, solicit, negotiate, compete. So those four components are typically present regardless of which buying approach is chosen, but not all the time. For example, advertising may not be required in the private sector. It may not be required to advertise your project formally, let's say in a newspaper, and formally invite vendors or sellers to bid on your project, while that may be required in the government sector, in the public sector. Also, competition is not used all the time. Some companies practice a different philosophy. They believe that competition is fake. It doesn't happen anyway. It's not productive to have competition among vendors. So there may be like some a mix and match between those components in any buying approach. The most important thing is that the assigned buyer must come up with the best approach for buying the items needed for the project, regardless of which building blocks are used in that best approach. Many companies have elaborate and well-documented procedures on how to approach various procurements. But again, regardless of which approach is chosen, what kind of standards a company has, I think the starting point of any approach to procurement is creating a list of things to be procured. Now, today, many potential sellers are found and dealt with using the internet, so there's no need for any formal advertising. It's all a matter of doing a Google search to find the vendors that can potentially deliver the parts that you're looking for or the services that are needed for your project. But sometimes a formal solicitation needs to take place, so this is often required by the government sector. Now, depending on what's being solicited, the documents or the announcements may take different forms. For example, some companies will issue the so-called invitation to bid or an invitation for bidding. This typically happens when a company is buying something simple, a commodity or commercial off-the-shelf item where it's very clear what's needed. So it's all a matter of soliciting price bids. So price is the most important consideration. However, when specific information on a product or a given company is required, so it's not just about prices, you also want to get additional information about the product or the company delivering the product. A company may issue something that is called a request for information or request for a quote. That seems to be a more elaborate version of an invitation to bid, because it will also, in addition to price, it will ask for those additional data points such as product information, data points related to product or the company supplying it. And different companies may have different forms, different names for the documents used to achieve the same purpose with respect to simple commercial off-the-shelf buys. But of course, if you're trying to procure something complex, something innovative, something that hasn't been done before, then most companies will issue a request for proposal or RFP. And by the way, a lot of the times under the term RFP, people actually mean much simpler forms. So an RFP is a more elaborate document that can be quite lengthy with many subsections, and some examples of sections included in an RFP document are as follows: statement of work, technical specifications, what exactly you need from a technical standpoint. That will also rely on drawings or blueprints, management requirements, how do you see this procurement relationship to be managed, terms and conditions, so those are typically rules arising in different situations. For example, what are we going to do if there are any back charges or if there are any delays or disputes, how those disputes will be resolved, and any other special provisions that are relevant to the product or service that is being procured. An RFP can be targeting multiple sources or a single source to provide a basis for subsequent negotiations, so it really depends on the approach or philosophy that the company is practicing. Again, when you're thinking about creating an RFP, the most important part of it is defining what. It's one of the most important challenges to define in legally enforceable terms what you expect sellers to do for you, what exactly you need from sellers. When you think about the what part, it's better to divide the definition into two parts: business definition and technical definitions. The business definitions are believed to be less problematic because regardless of what kind of product or service you're buying from a technical standpoint, the exact business processes, they seem to be fairly routine and standard, so it's harder to go wrong with business definition of what exactly and how exactly you want things to be delivered. It is the technical definition is where companies and organizations and project managers struggle a lot. Why they struggle? Well, for many reasons. Some of those reasons are listed here. Sometimes there is a lack of technical understanding of what needs to be done. Sometimes nobody is smart enough to create a blueprint for something that is needed in the future. Oftentimes life is the best teacher. It's only when you start working on a project that's when you start realizing all the technical details that go into your project. Sometimes you know what you need, but there's a lack of technical experience to fully describe it, to fully understand what kind of tools and technologies are needed as a part of the product or service being requested. Now, when it comes to business definition of what needs to be done, needs to be delivered, one good place to start is the so-called model contract. A model contract in many organizations, especially big, well-established organizations, is a template. It's a template for a possible contract that contains all those standard insertions or sections such as statement of work, what needs to be done, technical specifications, terms and conditions, Data reporting, what kind of manuals, what kind of reports you're expecting to be received together with the product or service. Status reviews, how do we make sure that the delivery is on time. Any management requirements, how do we see our collaboration. So those things are typically included in a model contract, in a template. And the preparation of subsequent contracts from a model contract is a relatively routine process, as managers and professional buyers might have done this many times. So it's very helpful when you have this template. But of course, if you're talking about a young startup organization, then they may not have all those templates and model contracts, and then anybody who wishes to procure something complex may have to start from scratch. Statement of work, once again, is something that is central to a model contract and to a subsequent request for proposal. A statement of work is a description of a product or service to be procured under a contract. It's basically a statement of requirements, both business and technical requirements towards a product or service. It's the only official description of the work requirement, so it's a very important official description. And because it's so important and because it's official, it should be clear enough so that the vendor can develop and price the required product or service in response to RFP. Now, statement of work may be called differently in different RFP templates, but in essence, it's a scope statement for the seller. What exactly you're expecting from the seller or vendor that is supposed to deliver a product or service for your project. Now, some typical sections under statement of work may include the following: the objectives of procurement, what are the main goals, a listing of the procurement deliverables, such as manuals, hardware, software, any kind of documentation. Performance standards, how do you expect the service and the product to perform, at what level, what kind of reliability or security standards are we talking about. Commitment of specific personnel, who will be involved in this project, what kind of services you're expecting from those people. Schedule is important, location, any reference documents related to standards or legal terms that are used, and all other important items related to the scope statement that you will be sending to potential vendors. Now, terms and conditions is another important section that may go to both a model contract and request for proposal. So terms and conditions cover a wide range of issues with specific rules for such situations as changes to statement of work, changes to specifications, order of precedence, which document is more important than the other ones. So if there's any kind of conflict between documents, what will be used as the ultimate source on the information as to what needs to be done, what needs to be delivered. Information related to testing and inspection, how it's going to proceed, what are the rules if a product fails testing or inspection. Rules related to delivery, warranty, any kind of governing laws related to the procurement relationship, title, ownership passing, termination, arbitration, back charges, and payments. All those situations can be described in the terms and conditions section. Now, the requirements for management oversight can be different depending on the nature of procurements and the organization itself. We mentioned before that sometimes management oversight is fully implemented and automated by an enterprise resource planning system. More specifically, it may have an MRP, material requirements planning, or an e-business module that manages and implements all different processes comprising a procurement relationship. But most likely, if you're buying something new and complex, your system may not be able to provide for all the features to handle this new complex procurement. So that will require some kind of manual management oversight. So this is something that you need to agree with your vendor, how you're going to manage the relationship to make sure that everybody's on track, everybody benefits from this management approach. This is just like one example of what can be done. You can develop a common Gantt chart. There is either a simple Gantt chart that includes both your master schedule for the project and the schedule of the vendor that is contributing products or services to your project. You can make this Gantt chart more complex by practicing earned value management approach that includes the so-called triple constraints of project management, which is scope, time, and cost. So it may look something like this. So here you have a Gantt chart with all those steps. Some of those steps will be on the side of the project team, some of them will be on the side of the vendor. So here you have all those tasks valued, you track their completion times, and then you calculate payments. So you may ask your vendor to develop this kind of chart so you can track progress and whether this project progress corresponds to your master schedule. You're also keeping track of their progress for the purposes of payment to see how much money they deserve, so to speak, to get from you. So this is like one example of a management oversight or management approach to a procurement relationship. Now, when it comes to technical definitions, you need to provide technical specifications and drawing. The purpose of technical specifications is to define product features, functions, physical attributes, limitations, design requirements, constraints, and the environment where the product will be used. Because all those things will define the way the product or service should be like. Sometimes technical specifications are grouped into two broad areas: design specifications, meaning what the product should be able to do, and also performance specifications, meaning the way the product is supposed to be like. In systems analysis and design, if we're talking about not physical products, but we're talking about software products, those two categories are often called functional and non-functional requirements. So functional means, okay, what are the things, what are the functionalities, what are the things that the software can do? And non-functional requirements means what are the features, what are the qualities that the software must have. It can be something related to reliability, uptime, or security. Technical specifications of a product or service ultimately define how success is measured. Some companies may tolerate a slight delay or even significant delay, a slight budget overrun, or even a substantial budget overrun, as long as what's needed for the project from a technical standpoint is delivered. If whatever is delivered does not meet your project requirements from a technical standpoint, let's say the hardware component is not working or malfunctioning, then it doesn't really matter how much time or money you spend on this hardware component. The project is a failure. So technical specifications are usually the most important and the problematic part. Now, when it comes to soliciting, injecting competition into procurement, it's based on the general belief that competition is good for businesses and consumers. There's a saying used by business people and economists that when companies or businesses compete, consumers win, because when there's a lot of competition for customers' business, then companies have incentives to invest into efficiency that lowers the price and also quality improvements. There are several types of competition used in procurement. Sometimes you have full and open competition. Let's say you place an ad in a newspaper and anyone can bid, anyone is invited to bid for your business. Sometimes competition is limited. It's among pre-qualified sellers. It's also called a two-step procurement, where first you pre-qualify sellers that can participate in bidding, and then you send your request for proposal or request for information to those pre-qualified sellers. Or sometimes competition among selected sources. Your circle of potential vendors is even more limited. Maybe some rational justifications can be used. You can say that, well, it's limited because I'm only looking for a particular quality or reputation from vendors. So that seems to be a more limited type of competition than the first two. Now, not everybody believes in competition. Some companies believe that competition is a farce. They're basically saying that it's fake. Even though a lot of companies pretend there's competition, there is not, because some sellers that have some sort of relationship or internal connection to the company that is releasing an RFP, they will still prevail. They will still win. So they say the competition is biased. So why pretend that it's a fair competition? Let's just do it in a more common sense way, where those favorite companies are approached in the first place. So let's not pretend that there's an open competition. Sometimes companies believe that competition is outright fake, which means that a fake entity is created just for the purposes of pretending that there is competition, or a real company pretends that they're interested in this business just to create this appearance that several companies compete with each other. In reality, it's only one company who is competitive. It's only one company who will get this project, who will get the business. So some companies do, and overall, like some companies do not believe in competition. They believe that competition is something that stands in the way of building a good relationship with vendors. So instead of pressuring vendors to give a lower price every year, and instead of reevaluating the contract, renegotiating the contract every year, instead they try to build a relationship, very close relationship with vendors. And of course, building a close long-term relationship with a vendor requires a long-term commitment that is free from competition. Otherwise, the vendor will say, why should I invest into quality of parts that I supply for this particular company when I know that next year I can lose the bidding war and it will be somebody else getting this business? So why should I invest into this relationship? Japanese companies practice that a lot. Unlike some American auto manufacturers, at least in the past, in the old days, in the 80s, Japanese auto manufacturers, they did not subject a lot of parts procurement projects for cars. They did not subject it to open competition. Instead, they built long-term relationships with those suppliers of parts used in Japanese automobiles, and they claim that those relationships, they help them to achieve much higher precision in those parts being supplied and much higher overall quality for cars being manufactured. So they believe that that's how you build and that's how you create incentives for vendors to provide high quality parts. So the so-called request for proposal or RFP document is very important for complex procurements. At a very high level, it must be very clear, complete, and also include some degree of competition. The exact parts that may go into a request for proposal document include the following. First of all, the cover letter that serves as a table of contents. It describes all files and attachments, specifies order of precedence, which sections are more important in case there is a contradiction, which sections have precedence over other sections, or which documents have precedence over other documents. The cover letter may also identify individuals by name who will represent the project, and also the assigned buyer, somebody who is actually in charge of this procurement. Statement of work, the scope statement for the procurement needs to be included as well. Technical specifications and drawing. Any special requirements, for example, in relation to insurance or bonding, can be included. Contract data requirements, what kind of data in the form of reports, manuals, or maybe actual data in a database need to be supplied with products and services. Cost or pricing format requirements, what are you looking for? Are you looking for a firm fixed price or labor and material type of pricing? Proposal certification, who will sign, who is responsible for approving different proposals, contracts. Requirements for contract-specific sections in relation to quality, risk management. A statement on whether an alternate methods can be proposed by the seller. So a seller may look at your RFP and say, okay, you're looking for X, we believe that you actually need Y, so let us give you a different proposal. So you need to specify whether this is accepted, whether this is allowed or encouraged. Also, proposal submission requirements, all the logistics related to time, date, format, number of copies, method of delivery, and so forth. A model contract can be included, and evaluation criteria, how you're going to evaluate the incoming responses to RFPs, and any other special requirements that can be important. So once vendors submit their responses to your RFP, a committee should be formed to evaluate responses to your RFP. Of course, the committee should consist of people with diversity of backgrounds, not just technical specialists, but also people from procurement department, maybe from the quality department, and obviously somebody from the project itself need to be included as well. So what you can do, you can evaluate responses to an RFP on a number of dimensions, with each dimension giving certain weight, like the extent to which the response meets your technical, managerial, quality, warranty, and price considerations. Let's say in this particular scenario, technical aspects are giving the most weight, although some organizations may actually value price much more and give much higher weight to price. So for each category, you can develop specific items or questions that the committee will answer, and it will be evaluated based on a Likert scale. Likert scale is used for all kinds of survey questions for quantifying certain qualitative, subjective considerations, or as they call them in social sciences, latent constructs. So, for example, let's say we're talking about technical considerations. So, one example of a Likert scale question in this category would be the hardware used by the vendor is based on well accepted open networking standards. And then for this question you can choose an answer ranging from 1 to 5, where 1 means strongly disagree, 5 means strongly agree, 3 means neutral, 4 means agree, and 2 means disagree. So depending on how well to what extent you agree to the statement, each vendor will receive points from 1 to 5, and there may be many questions like that under each of those dimensions. So once the committee members answer all those questions, their responses can be aggregated and averaged out to create an overall score, not only in each of those dimensions, but also an overall score for each vendor that will be subsequently used to decide which vendor will be selected for this project. So this completes Chapter 8 video presentation.